to actually think that you directed the whole thing of Eat Shit Bob, because Jack and myself were actually
We
going through
love
your
Eat
page.
Shit Bob.
Oh, thank you guys very much. I really appreciate that.
Because I remember when it actually came onto YouTube first, I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant! This is so great."
Thank you. Yeah, that was a very special project. It's probably my favorite thing I've ever worked on.
Was it hard to actually film that whole thing like in Times Square and actually filming it on the streets without getting so much attention?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing was hard. It was about we filmed it the week that it aired. So we filmed it on the Monday and Tuesday before it aired on Sunday. So, but we had about 4 weeks. It was about 4 weeks from script to being on set. So that whole process was challenging to kind of write the music, come up with the choreography, come up with the costumes, figure out the locations. The script is basically like, because part of it happens in the studio and then they leave the studio and go out into the street, and they were just kind of like, they go out into the street. So the process of figuring out where do they go, what kind of story do we want to tell in the locations, and then that becomes a bigger challenge. And then my director of photography and I were talking, and he was like, man, it'd be so cool if they ended in Times Square. And I knew in that moment that we would do it and it would be awful. It was challenging just getting it kind of roped off.
Right.
And having people not come in. I mean, we didn't shoot it until after midnight. But I mean, to be honest, the challenges of filming in Times Square were difficult, but the people were actually really respectful. No one really tried to come into the barricades. At a certain point, they couldn't really tell it was John. They didn't really know what we were filming because he had a top hat on and a big glittery suit, so like nobody knew who that was. So that was really helpful. And everybody just kind of stood and like would watch, and then they would applaud. And then when they realized we were, we shot for like 2 hours getting all the angles. So they kind of just started getting bored seeing the same thing over and over again, the same 35 seconds over and over again. So then the crowd kind of just started dispersing and everybody was pretty respectful. But I mean, the logistics of shooting, and there's a reason that musicals don't shoot in Times Square.
So just to kind of like shift the script a little bit, that I could see on your IMDb page that you started working on the show from 2014 when the show first started. And, obviously you guys have got your host who was originally on The Daily Show as a correspondent. How did you guys ensure that you weren't going to make the same show as The Daily Show, that it's going to be a completely different like satirical news program to The Daily Show?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think out of the gate, in terms of like how I'm concerned, like the idea of these highly polished scripted segments kind of ending the show, the evolution of that, I think was something to separate it from itself. Also, you got to think like when we first started, we came on right after Game of Thrones, so that was a big thing of like, if we're going to do these scripted segments, it has to look like it belongs on the same network and directly after the most polished, beautiful looking show that's been on television. Every show kind of goes through test episodes and does things, and I think it was a lot of credit to the writers and to John and Tim, the executive producer, for realizing that because we were on HBO, we could do things a little differently. You could do much longer segments that now is kind of the bread and butter of the show, for lack of a better phrase, of those long 20, 25, sometimes 30-minute segments focusing on one topic because you didn't have to take commercial breaks. The fact that, we could change the format. We didn't have to do an interview. Instead, we could focus on finding people that were really important to interview, that we wanted to interview. So instead of ending every week with an interview because someone had a movie coming out or a book coming out, we could focus on if we wanted to interview Edward Snowden or Anita Hill or Monica Lewinsky or Stephen Hawking. You could kind of focus that thing that's kind of so universally a part of these kinds of shows, the interviews, and you could make those a little bit more specific to the story that you're telling as opposed to just switching gears and speaking to somebody. So I think kind of the being able to be on HBO, being able to curse, obviously, and do things that are a little bit more excessive, not having to take commercial breaks, and being able to make each show specific to the story as opposed to having to follow a format. And I think as we started doing more of the scripted content, more of the scripted pieces, more kind of sketches in the studio. Especially they really started evolving after we did this Donald Trump piece where we had this big sign that said Drumpf on it because we found out that there's a name down the line in Trump's lineage before he was elected. Obviously, we had absolutely no influence on the election whatsoever because he won. But I think like after we started seeing like, oh, we can do bigger things, we can do these kind of massive breaks from the format. Like we blew up a sign that said 2016 at the end of that year. Once we realized we could do these big things that didn't necessarily fold into the format, I think that helped open up even the in-studio kind of John at the desk portion of the show. And I mean, I can take the smallest possible amount of credit.
You know, that's very similar to like when Howard Stern kind of switched over from FM radio and moved over to Sirius. He was given a lot more freedom, you know, do longer segment interviews. It's kind of similar, you know, to what you guys did over at HBO. But my question to you is, Chris, I mean, you guys must have a bigger budget than Game of Thrones, because considering all these lawsuits you guys get into, I mean, it's unbelievable. So how does your team really navigate? You know, personally, I really love the Bob Murray story. I thought that was hilarious. You know, and how do you guys necessarily navigate that? And how does, you know, does HBO handle that end of the realm? Like, how does that work?
I mean, we have really incredible lawyers. I mean, that's like John mentioned during that Bob Murray slap suit piece. I mean, it's what it really comes down to. I mean, we have an incredible research department who are very thorough and very diligent. And I just can't say enough good things about them. We have really amazing writers. And so a lot of the stuff is researched very, very, very heavily ahead of time. So by the time we get to the air, we feel really confident about what we're doing. Even the pieces that I work on, the kind of stupid stuff that I do for the show, still has to go through this process of making sure that we're not doing something that is misrepresenting the truth, saying something that is patently false, unless it's for the joke and it's so false. It's ridiculous, like all the things Bob Murray, we accused him of doing in that song were clearly not, they were so absurd that you couldn't realistically make a case that we were saying he masturbates to Schindler's List, right? So that it was so ridiculous you could kind of get away with it. It's just a big team, like every aspect of the show is just a massive team effort, so that, you know, by the time we get in front of the audience, or used to before the quarantine, you know, we all felt really confident that the thing we were saying was truthful. That's something that I've noticed is really, and John has said in interviews, is really important to him, that the foundation has to be solid before you start building the house on it, right? So the foundation of the facts and the case has to be really solid before you can start putting jokes on top of it and kind of crafting your narrative. You have to make sure that everything you're building it on is really sound and really solid. I'm so thankful that so much of my job is just the dumb stuff, you know, the stupid stuff that I could spend 4.5 sleepless weeks worrying about how we're going to get Mr. Nutterbutter and a, you know, barbershop quartet vest, you know, and I don't have to worry too much about the minutia of that stuff. But, you know, there's obviously a lot of overlap.
And does John have the final say? Like, you know, if John doesn't want to necessarily do a segment making fun of Bob Murray, you know, jacking off to Schindler's List, like, can he scrap that altogether, or does he push for it? Like, what's the dynamic?
It is like a real group effort for everything. I mean, obviously he's on the show and he's the host, but I mean, they put a lot of effort and work in cultivating a team that everybody really trusts. So everything kind of feels like a conversation. It's not like a very he doesn't run the show like a dictator or anything. It's very much like a group effort. And by the time you get to something like that, you know, or you get to like the kind of minutia of a joke or one line or something, usually there's such a solid foundation that, you know, it's how any collaboration, I'm sure like you guys collaborating on this podcast, as you're just talking about people to interview or things to do, it doesn't become this big, like, massive discussion about every little minute decision. You just kind of build a rapport with people. You know, you hear stories about like SNL, and it's like Lauren is sitting there being like, yes, no, maybe, do it.
Exactly.
It's on the air. I think that's like a very specific, also, you know, it's what, season 45 of that show? So it's
something
like
ridiculous.
Something absurd. and that show, because it goes on live and it's so complicated, I'm certainly not besmirching SNL. I have nothing but respect for that show, but it's just like a different kind of vibe. So our show, because it's mostly about one topic once a week, there's not kind of that, I don't think there needs to be that level of like overlording from anyone, which is not to diminish John's role in the show, obviously.
Was there ever like a show where you kind of felt this is too risky to actually put on air? Let's scrap it. Let's actually like bring a completely new episode in because, or what was like your hardest episode that you actually did land up putting on air?
That's a good question. I don't really think it's ever gotten to that point because there's so much like research and stuff ahead of time. You know, I think by the time a story would get to that point, it would be in like the very early research stages. So if you see a couple articles about a story about, I don't know, some kind of like farming problem somewhere, and you start looking into it, by the time it would ever get to be something where everyone would start working on it, you pretty much know by that point, does it have a solid foundation or does it not? But I mean, I think the most like challenging one of like, well, this is, I guess, a risk was the Bob Murray. The original Bob Murray one was definitely like, we knew, as we said in the episode, we'd gotten a letter saying not to do the show or we'd get sued.
It was phenomenal TV though. Phenomenal television, I'll tell you that.
Well, I appreciate that. It just felt like this is worth rolling the dice.
I mean, the risk factor really added to it. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
With the letter and everything, you know?
For the audience, perfect. It was a little, yeah, it was a little stressful. Not in like a bad way or like a way where anybody felt uncomfortable, but you know, he's a wealthy man, powerful guy, clearly not a fan of us or our show, you know, politically speaking.
Yeah.
I mean, that really was kind of the most.
How about the Yankees one? The Yankees one was also probably pretty controversial too when
when we sent the people.
Yeah, and they got dressed up. That was a big one too, you know?
That was a lot of fun because me and this guy, Matt, who used to work in the same department, we were there. They didn't know that we were there. We were there to like film if something happened. Like we had little like pocket cameras with us if something happened. But yeah, we assumed they'd get kicked out. But like to the Yankees' credit, they were super cool with it. They put them on the Jumbotron. They put on the Jumbotron like they said the name of the show.
Yeah,
they were
that's
like
hilarious.
Really, really cool about it. Even though we had spent a portion of the episode not saying necessarily the nicest stuff in the world about them. And it's like you find that more often than not. Like, yeah, there's the Bob Murrays of the world, and I guess the people who maybe we take a more pointed opinion about. But when it comes to like corporations and stuff like that, they usually get the joke more often than not, I'd say.
Yeah, I understand.
That was, you know, there's like some stressful stuff or some like, I know like the Edward Snowden interview was like a big kind of stressful thing in this show, not because we thought something drastically bad was going to happen. Plus, like, we like to keep everything really, really kind of secret, so we weren't letting people know that we were interviewing. And, you know, I think, like, for me, what becomes stressful is kind of stuff like that. Like, when we interviewed Monica Lewinsky, we really wanted it to be, from a storytelling perspective, if people don't know the interviews are coming, I feel personally like they hold a little bit more weight. And then you're able to tell your story leading up to it, especially Monica Lewinsky or Anita Hill. You know, we're able to tell these very complex stories ahead of time where we can use them as a part of it, but also use other people. And then you kind of get this catharsis at the end of this interview. And if you know the whole time that you're watching it, that this interview is coming, it's kind of telegraphing where the story's going. And I think John and the writer.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do you think Bill Clinton watched that Monica Lewinsky episode?
I absolutely no idea. Absolutely no idea.
I think he probably did.
You think he did?
Why not? The damage is done.
I don't know that he watches our show. I have no idea. I think you might be vastly overthinking how much people like our show or how many people watch our show.
Josh, I mean, you have to agree with me though, but I don't think I'm overestimating that at all.
Well, I mean, with the amount of Emmys and stuff that you guys have won, I don't know. You never know.
Maybe. I mean, look, maybe he certainly didn't tell me about it. He certainly didn't reach out to me and let me know what he thought. So I hope people watched it. I think she told a very compelling story and had a really compelling side of her story. I think it's good for people to watch to exercise their empathy, which
Absolutely.
I think is a very important exercise.
What has the whole show been like? Obviously, for the past couple of weeks, filming from home, and not having like an audience, and especially like obviously corresponding not in like the same room. What has that been like for you guys?
I mean, I don't think it's been challenging. I think like it is kind of for everybody. It's tough to not be together. It's tough, you outside of like the human element of just like a lot of us have been working together for 6 years. So like you just miss that camaraderie, you miss that all that stuff. It's a challenging show to make in some ways, being really far apart. But in other ways, we're lucky that the show is ostensibly the meat and potatoes of it is John at the desk. So if you can set up a desk, you could pretty much got a show. Speaking of Tim Barnes, what like Jimmy's done is made it such a personal thing. He's kind of taken like the exact opposite course from us, right? Like 180-degree course, but like the commitment to that is what makes it good and unique, right?
Absolutely.
And it kind of works with Jimmy's vibe, right? He's like a fun guy. He wants to do games and like it's like a very much a variety show. So he was able to embrace that, which I think is like a super smart decision for a show like that. If John was just like hanging out in a sweater, walking around his house, I don't think it would like work for the kind of show that we have.
There is one slight